All right, so I've started the webinar and I'm just going to give our audience about a minute to settle in, and then we'll get started. All right, let's get started. Good morning, and thank you for joining us here on the Arizona Capital Times Morning Scoop. I'm Gary Grotto, the executive editor of the Arizona Capital Times, and today we're going to discuss something that's kind of gone by the wayside, civics education. But this isn't going to be a downer because Arizona is taking steps to emphasize the importance of civics education and implementing it into our K-12 public school system and higher education system. And one of the things we're going to touch on is the civics education component of the new general education policies of Arizona's 3 universities. First, I want to thank our sponsor, the Arizona Board of Regents, which is the governing body of the state's public universities, Northern Arizona University, Arizona State University, and the University of Arizona. The board's mission is to ensure access for qualified students to our undergraduate and graduate institutions, promote the discovery, application, and dissemination of new knowledge, extend the benefits of the universities to Arizona residents, and maximize the benefits derived from taxpayer dollars. Without sponsors like the Board of Regents, we wouldn't be able to have important conversations like this one today. And now I'd like to introduce our panel. Joining us is Justice Rebecca White Birch. Justice Birch served on the Arizona Supreme Court from 2002 to 2014. The last 5 years as the Chief Justice. Before that, she was on the Arizona Court of Appeals from 1998 to 2002. And Justice Birch also worked as the state Solicitor General, as the director of the legal writing program at ASU College of Law, and several years in private practice. So good morning,
Gary. Good morning, Gary.
Good morning, and nice to see you again. Also joining us is Regent Larry Penley. Regent Penley is president of Penley Consulting and past president of the Thunderbird School of Global Management, former president of Colorado State University, and past chancellor of the Colorado State University System. Regent Penley is the former dean of the W.P. Carey School of Business at ASU, and he was a professor of management and Robert Herberger Arizona Heritage Chaired Professor. Regent Penley has held academic positions in Venezuela and Mexico, developed education programs in partnership with institutions in China and Mexico, and is a professor emeritus at ASU. Good morning, sir, and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Gary.
And our last panelist is Arizona House Speaker Rusty Bowers. Speaker Bowers' most recent stint in the Arizona legislature began in 2015, and he was voted speaker by his peers in 2019. He also served in the House from 1993 to 1996, in the Senate from 1997 to 2001. It's no secret Speaker Bowers is by trade a sculptor, as some of his work is displayed around the Capitol. And we learned this morning that Speaker Bowers is one of 5 people to be honored with the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award. Congratulations, sir. And is an acceptance speech in order here?
It was a privilege to be honored, but as I mentioned earlier, to do what you promised you would do in your oath, as I, in my conscience, felt I did, should be the least we would expect of a public servant. And that thought Mr. Pappas, my general counsel, brought to my mind, and I appreciate it, but we'll, in spite of the award, we have to keep going.
Congratulations, sir.
Thank you.
So, oh yes, let me remind our audience that we have a live chat, and I ask you to submit your questions to the panelists, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So I want to put this little bit of information here. This is from the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And let's see here, I got to share it here. The people in the control room are a little slow today. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
So, this is some data, some of the highlights. They found a lot of information. And one of them is, U.S. adults who currently name all three branches of government increased to 56%, the highest since the survey began in 2016. As you can see here, there's still 20% who couldn't name the three branches of government. More respondents named most of the freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment, and 3/4 cited freedom of speech. And this last one is rather interesting. More than half of Americans, 61%, incorrectly said Facebook is required to permit all Americans to express themselves freely on Facebook under the First Amendment. And so we'll get back to those a little more in depth, as we go along. But my first question is for Regent Penley. So as I mentioned earlier, the three public universities have already or are in the process of revising their general education programs, and they're including a civics education component alongside, mathematics, the natural sciences, arts, and humanities. Can you tell our audience how and why it came to be that the universities are now including civics education in the general education program?
Certainly, Gary. I think many of us on the board started with a sense that what was happening in our society, well, as you noted through the Annenberg results, there's some improvement in knowledge of civics, knowledge of the government. Yet still, as you saw there on your data, 20% cannot name any branch of government, and 40% or more of the public cannot name all three. So there's improvement, but there's also a challenge. And those of us on the board saw that as one issue. We also saw the lack of civility in civic discourse as a real issue that prevented us from really celebrating what we are as a full democracy. We also saw intolerance of views and people's sense of isolation. I'll choose my media because it agrees with me. We also saw disrespect for those in your profession, Gary, disrespect for the media. And all of us who've been quoted in the media can be annoyed at times, but it's a matter of fact that the media matter too as part of our institutions of democracy. So we saw a need to really educate our students so that they could be fully a part of this republic when they graduated from school. And that's what started this process, was that sense that we needed to do more, we needed to be better. As Jefferson said, one can't be both ignorant and also live in a democracy, to misquote him just a bit. What he did say is we need to be educated if we're going to have a democracy.
All right, well, thank you for that. So Justice Birch, you told a funny little story yesterday about your daughter and when you were talking about knowledge of civics and so forth. And, can you share that with the audience a little bit? And then just tell us, what's the basic knowledge of American citizens an American should have?
Sure. So the story from my daughter was this. I was telling her I was going to do this and I was excited about it. And we were talking about different things. And then she said, why is this so important? And I said a few of the things that Regent Penley just said, that, a lot of Americans can't name a single Supreme Court justice. And she said, well, wait a minute. She said, can you name the chair of the FDA? And I said, no. She said, can you name a single member? And I said, no. And it occurred to me that there may be a certain arrogance in the judiciary that we think people should know who's on the US Supreme Court. So it took me back a step. So I started thinking about what basic knowledge should Americans have? Now, this is a question that I know the regents and the 3 universities have spent a great deal of time thinking about. So my comments are kind of off the cuff, but here goes. We, students, Americans, should understand the basic structure of government, the 3 branches of government and how they operate, when they operate separately, and how their work can serve as a check and balance on the work of another branch. They should also understand how the structure came about and why and how it operates. This, of course, should be divided into spending time on the work of each of the 3 branches. The executive, the president in the federal system, executes the laws and possesses the power of the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. But the executive branch also encompasses the many federal agencies that control much of the work of government these days. On the legislative side, Congress and the federal system consists of 2 houses. Americans should understand the representation in each of those houses and how the houses work together and how that representational structure came about and why. They should learn a bit about the legislative process. They don't need to get greatly into detail about strike all amendments, but they should understand basically how the process works. They should learn about the checks the executive has on the legislative process, and they should learn about the checks the legislature, the Congress has through its power of the purse, not only on the other branches, but on states as well. For the judiciary, the courts have a right to review cases brought before them. In the federal system, the courts actually have quite limited but powerful and important jurisdiction. They can review laws for constitutionality in compliance with the federal constitution, and they can interpret federal laws. So that's on the 3-branch side. They should also understand fundamental principles such as the supremacy of the Constitution in our hierarchy of laws. And they should also understand federalism, the relationship between the federal government and the states. And of course, they should understand the founding documents, including the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. With respect to the Constitution, it's the fundamental law of the United States. So students should learn how bare bones it actually is, just 7 articles and then a slew of amendments. Many Americans are generally aware of the bill of their rights contained in the Bill of Rights, but a lot of us could use a brush up. Some are of the opinion that rights are absolute, like some of your friends who were discussing the First Amendment in connection with, I think you mentioned Facebook. But there are lots of important rights there: speech, religion, assembly, press, lots of criminal rights, due process, equal protection. The list goes on, and whole courses are taught just on small parts of the Constitution. Finally, I think Americans should appreciate the brilliance of the structure of government. They should learn some history. They should learn about the built-in system of checks and balances and how important it is that the branches and participants operate sort of in their lanes, that is, as the founders intended. If that happens, our government actually functions quite well, though it has some intentionally built-in gridlock. Our government depends on citizens to keep it going, and it requires active participation by knowledgeable citizens who understand the institutions of government, the governing documents, and the citizens' rights and responsibilities. I think I've gone on too long, but I hope that's a worthy start.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a lot, but it really isn't, right? I mean, it's pretty basic stuff if you know.
I think it's doable.
Yeah. So, Speaker Bowers, why is it important to have a solid civics education? You're muted, sir. Oh.
That's probably better for everybody that I'm muted. But, it's best. A civics education is not only learned in an institution. It's not part of this. A true education is something that permeates into the psyche, into the soul, into the heart of individuals as valued information that guides life, guides everyday decisions. We could call those character traits or virtues, for example. And as you, I, all of us have seen in differing individuals, sometimes an education in a institutional setting is undervalued wrongly, but overvalued as well. That's why I think parents, families, the flexibility of an educational system to address the values that hold the society together, and that civics education, that appreciation is what I am most concerned with in the evolution of our country, and have been through a bit of that myself to illuminate the value of that lately. And I see an erosion of civility that should be also a part of a civics education, not just, yes, I can name, as the justice said, the 3 branches of government, which I think are important, or have a basic knowledge of how the legislative process works. But we have seen, as was recently illuminated in an article, a national article, how the explosion of social media thinking, of Twitter thought, that your entire intellectual ability can be compressed into 140 characters. If that's the case, that's where it deserves to be, and should be treated as such. And so most civil interaction in a civil system, and I'm not talking about the judgment of civility, but in a civil system, is eroding. And social media is, I think, one of the areas where it has eroded fastest in negative, aggressive, threatening, intimidating speech that is so easily liked, quote unquote, and having enough likes can make your particular blog or your speech have a commercial value. And so it distorts the vision and the truthfulness of a position when you're trying to increase your likes. And that is a sad commentary. I think it's worth mentioning. But that civics education that's truly held by a person is the glue that keeps them from acting uncivilly, and multiply yourself and your civics ability times 350 million, and you've got America. And it's very simplistic, but I think that is illuminative.
You know, Speaker Bowers, to your very point, that's why when the Regents considered what we wanted in civics education, we focused on this issue of civil discourse and insisting that there be kind of a component associated with argument and debate in a civil way. And we felt that addressed several issues. The one you've just raised, the ability to listen to someone's argument, which may not be mine, and present a reasonable response to that. And as well, to be able to address what's factual, what's inference, and what's judgment. And that seems to be so lacking in our discourse today. So we felt that belonged there in a college education. We also thought that the sense of how our history affects the present is also important. So if one looks back, as you and Justice Birch know, The Constitution wasn't born full blown as a document from the beginning. People argued and they said, no, we won't accept that. Our state will vote against it if you have that. So it was a compromise. And that's the way you, who live in a world of politics much of the time, as well as your role of art and other things that you do, but you understand that so very well. And we thought that needed to be a part of civics education as well, along with, of course, landmark court decisions, the role of the Constitution, some of the very issues that you, Justice Birch, mentioned earlier.
When did you start to see the, I guess, the degradation of civil discourse, or the, when it started going bad?
Well, any one of us could probably answer that, Gary.
Yeah. And
Maybe
that was for everybody, I guess.
But I think so many of us have seen that for quite some years. And the Annenberg data points to that you put up on the screen earlier, that this is not a new phenomenon. It didn't occur in this administration, the last presidential administration, or the one before that. It's been going on for some time. And I'll go back to Abraham Lincoln in the 30s, 1830s, that is. And Lincoln at that point, when he was only 28 years old, gave that great Lyceum speech where he said, oh my goodness, in better words than I'm using, the founding fathers have all died. How are we going to preserve this temple of liberty that we have? And he was concerned with the lack of a sense of rule of law at that particular point, and the fact that people were taking the law into their own hands with lynchings in the South particularly. And he called on everyone to focus in on that temple of liberty and those institutions of democracy at that particular stage. So when I say it's going on for a long time, that's why you reminded me of Lincoln and being 28 years old and having the brilliance to see that constant preservation of democracy in every age and every generation will be essential to retain that temple of liberty that we call the United States of America.
So I have a question from, I don't know if it's a question or more of a statement, from an audience member, Rivko. And I'd like to know if anyone has given a definition of civics education versus history and government. Said, I think Speaker Bowers is now raising this, but I'd like to hear more about this. Can anybody speak to that?
Let me just maybe share a thought that comes to mind. The initiation date of incivility is less important than the recognition of incivility. And as you have, as Regent Bentley has just pointed out, the initiation and recognition has been going on for a long time. I wouldn't know how we would rate that, like the little scale we saw earlier of who knows, just what the shapes of government, blah, 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 on some scale. But the constant need to recognize that it even exists and that it is worth addressing and needs to be addressing is a duty, I think, of citizenship. That there is a balance between my lips and your lips. And that as the Regent just mentioned, that I don't need to always have the perfect preservation of all my guaranteed rights in the Bill of Rights or any other amended right. But that area of overlap where judgment of courts and just common judgment of a common toleration, I give a little in order to keep us unified. The colonies needed each other. Individually, they were more at risk. And thankfully, they recognized that need accommodated some abuse of individual liberty that over time has been corrected. So as a historical review, we could say, look, such and such founding father had enslaved people in his employ, or in his, not employ, in his ownership, in a horribly obtuse way. But the fact that he did, and the fact that even how he treated that system and how he treated that fact is also important. But we get too attached to an agenda currently when we go to pick fights with the past. And in our fight with our past, we don't look at the dynamic value of recognition of incivility, the recognition of abuse, and change it as it can be accommodated and preserve unity. Unity is also ask the Ukraine how, if it would be nice to be unified with somebody else, to the extent that someone would stand with you. They are trying to get us to illuminate to the world that unity of soul and vision is bigger than unity of paper and agreement on paper. So that history, the value of history, I think is phenomenal. But the context of a moving history and how it evolved shows the human desire for improvement and tolerance, and to show some of the virtues that we all should be working on in ourselves. As I said, multiply ourselves times 350 million. What do you get? You get peace? You get confusion? Do you get abuse? What do you get? And so that's a thought that comes to mind.
So, one of the things that they'll be teaching, in this civics education component is, civic engagement. And, civics is more than just, of course, naming the Supreme Court justices. It's about, voting, volunteering, that sort of stuff. So, one form of civic engagement is writing your elected representative. Speaker Bowers, what spurs people to become civically engaged and contact Speaker Bowers or your colleagues?
What's the best way, did you ask?
What spurs people to, become civically engaged and contact you and your colleagues? I mean, what do you see the most of?
I will say that it would be generally probably recognized by all my peers that people do not write me to tell me how wonderful their life is. That they typically have some worry or concern, and when they feel that there is something that should be addressed to make things more just, to more fair, to address some public need, there is an energy of change or recognition that they want others to feel as well. So I don't know if that's the answer. I see some of the quotes going by, and I'm reminded that so many times in these things, we're always looking for a snippet. Oh yeah, I agree with that. Oh, I got him on that. Someone just wrote, unity is not the goal. Try living without it, but also try living without tolerance, or try living without vision or intellectual curiosity. It's the balance that we need, the balance of all these values, not the exaltation of one over the total diminution of another. But back to your point, people are usually, there's a concern that drives them.
Okay.
By the way, I do think that values are what Speaker Bowers is saying is important, and is, I still recall my father and his value for tolerance, and that affected me a great deal in the way he conducted his business, in terms of the value of tolerance, as well as how he treated his employees back in the 60s with health insurance, for example. It may not have been great health insurance, but it was something. And the kind of customers he had. And because I grew up in the South, and I'm white, my father was white, typically white citizens went to white businesses and Black citizens went to Black businesses. And my father had customers of all types. And I said, well, why is that, Dad? He says, I treat everyone the same way. And so it is this value issue that's very hard to deal with, that I think comes not just from what we do at the universities or in K through 12, but it really is very much a family issue, as you're pointing out, Speaker.
May I say something?
Yeah.
My mother, now deceased of 5 or 6 years, had written, part of her driving force in her later years was to, as much as she could, get us all to cooperate in writing our family history. Any stories about Dad, any stories about Mom, any stories of our own, to get them, write them, hold them, value them. And so I ended up recently at the moving of my sister to Hawaii with my dad's history written by my mother. And in it was the yearbook of my father going to Alhambra High School and then to Pasadena Junior College. And I had heard that my father was a friend of Jackie Robinson. When I looked at the book, there was a whole book about Jackie Robinson. And unfortunately, she didn't keep the whole annual, she chopped it up, but cut out pictures with the dedications of what Jackie Robinson had written to my dad. And then learning from one of the only surviving neighbors that the Robinson boys and the Bowers boys would go to each other's houses and spend the night. My dad said he was LDS, and he and Jackie, when they first met, had to fight everybody going to school and fight everybody coming home. And so he said, we figured out that we could run faster than them. So they ran both ways. And they both ended up running track together in the yearbook. And Jackie says, to Wes, to the swellest guy on the squad, and please tell your dad that little incident in Compton was not true and not hold it against me. And I have no idea what that was, but I'm sure curious. But now think about that. In the day, my dad was the traveling companion of Jackie Robinson. He slept in the same room with Jackie Robinson. And he did it both as a friend and as a need. And that was his assignment. But he said, hey man, this is my neighbor. We've been together a while. So it's been a cool and illuminating thing for me. A nice bit of my history where my father, and he passed it to me.
Gary, we're hearing a lot, I think, about how history and our family history informs our ideas about civility and civics. And we've talked about the basic knowledge that we should have. And we were asked a really good question by one of the listeners, what is the line between history and politics and civics? The answer to that last one is, I don't really know. There's quite a blend, but given all that, and I suppose this goes to Regent Penley, how are we going to teach this in a way that gets this broad subject matter to come together and to come alive for these students so that they can take it and use it in their real lives?
Well, and I think that's a challenge, and that's why we've been very specific in what we've called for in our policy statement, not just knowing the three branches or knowing which documents were the founding documents, but how those documents have shaped what we're doing today, so that integration of the very elements that you just described is worthy of a college education, so that you go beyond, yes, you have to know what those documents are and what's in them, but how they shape us today. As well, you look at the great Supreme Court decisions. Yes, we ought to know about them, but we ought to know how they're shaping what's going on. So if you go back to the Warren Court, which you know better than I, you look at that great decision that really exploded schools and really brought people together in the same school. Yet what happened after that was the Civil Rights Act and a whole set of other laws. So the integration of what occurred in the 50s with the Warren Court, with what happened subsequently, to me is, I think the answer to your question, Justice Birch, is that integration, the ability to think in a complex way, don't you think?
I do.
Well said.
And I've got another question from the audience, from Kenja. Civics education is very much about people learning how to work together in a system that has to incorporate 330 million plus different minds and mindsets. How do we balance the American ideal of rugged individualism with processes that have to be done with lots of other people? Anybody?
Well, I don't know that rugged individualism, I know we use that phrase to show a self-reliant capability that people have been either prepared or thought about it and work towards being able to support themselves, support families as chosen, and their community in a positive way. And that they don't depend on everybody else, at least for their individual support. But everybody depends on everybody in some way or the other. And so I think that's an element, that there is an interdependency in a civilization. Two individuals who meet in the woods in some distant alpine place, not part of a nation, can probably treat each other civilly, but they won't have a civilization. And that need to work together can come from a chosen course where my individual capabilities can be combined to make a civilization with others and to maintain it. You know, I get to talking, I don't forget what the question was.
Well, I got another question here, and this thing keeps moving so fast. Somebody mentioned that, and I was going to bring it up, of course, and bring it up with you, Speaker Bowers, because this came under your watch, basically. Somebody mentioned that by law, students must pass a civics exam as a graduation requirement in our Arizona District Public Schools. It begins much earlier than college level. Can you talk a little bit about, what's happened in the last few years as far as, laws and civics education? I think it was House Bill 2064 back in
I remember it. The governor had stressed that when he was first elected, at least when we came in, I think, kind of together, that we needed civics education. So we had this set of questions. I don't know how many, I think it was like 100 questions or 50 questions, and that you'd be expected to know them. And again, you can't get civics education from an institution. It's something that you learn to appreciate. And I might be able to even pass it, but I don't think I'd hit it perfectly. But that shouldn't be I passed the test, therefore I'm a member of a civil society. I've got my little gold star. It's a basic level of rote memory. But what I hope that it can do is just inspire a desire to live it and to maybe incorporate it as a value, as we've mentioned earlier. But it reminds me of another, in the Ivanizing of each other, which we're so adept at doing in politics. Recently, there's been a bill to have the Pledge of Allegiance and a moment of moral reflection in our schools, which I think that'd be fantastic. Except that the bill says, you shall recite the Pledge of Allegiance, and you shall engage in a moment of moral reflection. Do you see a difference?
Yeah.
It boggles my mind. Of course, it will be used in the spin of politics that Bowers doesn't believe in the Pledge of Allegiance or in moral reflection. When I hope I practice that every single day, multiple times a day. That would be well said if I try to do that. But I'm guessing in Russia, you shall say the pledge. When we all stand up, you better not be sitting down, and you better not, whatever I don't know what the logistics of a pledge to the country versus here, where some people don't stand. And okay, they're free and they have an expression of their liberty and conscience that they may not feel so disposed. That's their right. I would hope that we would live in a way that our recognition of what the country blesses us with in both in history and unity and in self-correction would say, yeah, I'm pledging to that banner. I'm going to reflect on my moral status in its impact personally and upon others. Is that an answer? Again,
It sounds like an answer to me, sir.
All
So, Justice
Gary?
Birch. Yes, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Going back to a question that one of the listeners asked about balancing rugged individualism versus government. It seems like in a good civics course, one of the things you'd come to learn is that the Constitution is the compact by which we've agreed to govern ourselves. And so in a lot of realms, you can exercise your liberty interests to do what you want in your home and in free space, as long as you don't generally affect other people. And as long as you don't violate laws, but we've agreed to elect representatives to pass laws. And the implicit agreement is that we'll comport with those laws. So governance is about how we put forth our governing structures, how we agree to cooperate and live together. So one of the things that you learn in life is nothing's as simple as it seems originally. It's fine to say we should all be free to do whatever we want to do all the time, but it just can't be. We have to learn to live with our neighbors. And we do it in lots of subtle ways that aren't legislated by laws. But for example, most of us cut our grass if we have grass, or we keep our houses neat. There's no law. Well, there may be if you get grossly extreme. But for most of the time, most people behave civilly and well. They like their neighbors. They get along with them. I mean, these are the compacts by which we comport ourselves. So rugged individualism at some point has to bend to the needs of a civil society, and a good civics course will help blend that in.
I think the justice has made a very good point. And I'd like to go to another comment or stream of comments that's also we've had before us. And that really addresses the issue of where and how we learn to be good citizens and learn civics. And the speaker mentioned it earlier as he talked about a number of issues. Yes, as a regent, I'm proud of what we're doing in higher education in Arizona. Very few boards and very few states have insisted on civics education as a part of a college education. You can count them really, well, it doesn't take long to count them. So we are a leader in that in Arizona and what this board has done. Back to what everyone has said, yes, one learns about one's responsibility as a citizen through what happens in the family. You learn about it both inside of class and outside. And I'd like to put in a plug for what the Center for the Future of Arizona is doing. There's a program they have called Participatory Democracy. And it's quite an interesting program because they take an issue to the public schools, K through 12, middle schools and high schools. Administration allocates a small amount of budget, and students get to compete of ideas of how they ought to spend that budget. And then ultimately they vote. Now, one might think that the voting is the part that's democracy, but it's not just the voting. It's the argument, the discussion, the public presentation of the issues that's also a part of participatory democracy. I recall in Egypt when some years ago, when people could vote and everyone was excited, it's democracy. And I thought, oh, but they don't have the rule of law. Oh, but they don't have a free press. Oh, yes, it's great that they could vote in Egypt, but they needed all of those other underpinnings, the institutions of democracy. And we do teach those both inside of class and outside of class. And that's why what the Center for the Future of Arizona is doing is so very important. And I would hope receives the funding to expand across the state.
I'm sure they'll appreciate that plug, Regent Penley. Got another question here for Justice Birch. So, I read an interview with you in the Republic, and you once said that Governor Hall appointed you to the Supreme Court because I understand how government works. When you interact with the public and even legislators, when you were a Chief Justice or a justice, where did you see gaps in knowledge of understanding how government works and basic understanding of American civics?
Well, let me start by saying, I think it's useful to understand how government works. And when Governor Hull appointed me to the Supreme Court, I'd already been a judge on the Court of Appeals. I'd been the Chief Deputy Attorney General, and in that capacity, I was the legislative liaison for the Attorney General's office to the legislature. So I'd spent a good deal of time at the legislature, and you learn to understand budgets. I was their designated lobbyist as well. So you learn how to approach the legislature. You learn how to, frankly, marshal friends and address enemies so that you bring them over to your camp. You learn how to count votes. You learn how to discourage bringing a vote forward if you don't have those votes lined up. So there's a lot of good knowledge. You learn how to approach the governor's office if there's some budget requests that you're going to have on behalf of the court system. So learning how to work with the various branches of government is important. And look, it's not just important in terms of civics, it's important in terms of business. If you were going to build a shopping center, you learn how to deal with zoning laws. You would find out about your utilities, how you get them in. You'd learn about environmental laws. There's a lot that you learn about a process before you just jump in. And the same is true with government if you want to get things done. Speaker Bowers was talking about people writing to legislators. And I think Regent Penley picked up on the point that it's getting our people interested in these issues that's going to cause them to learn to use whatever civics education they have from wherever they got it from high school, from grade school, from their parents, I would hope, from reading the newspapers and watching the news. And we range a little far afield here, but there are lots of good places to learn about civics. The Center for the Future of Arizona is one. Justice Scalia has had a bunch of very pithy comments about civility and civics, especially with his discourses with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, many years ago, started a program called iCivics. And that's a free resource, and it trains teachers how to teach civic engagement from a very young age up through high school. But they've created video games that students can play. You can pretend to be the president, and you have to decide if you have a particular issue come in, where do you send it? Is it to the Department of Transportation, to the post office? Do you send in the Marines in the first instance? Or you can pretend to be a Supreme Court justice. How do you work with others? How do you decide? What do you base your decisions on? So there are lots of good good resources. I've strayed a little far from your question about, what is the value of learning how the branches work together, and do gaps hurt? I think gaps do hurt. I'm not sure I have a specific example for you, but failure to understand your rights causes people not to assert them in a timely and proper manner, and they lose them. You can waive your right to a jury trial. You can waive your right to counsel almost without even knowing it. So there are rights that you waive by having gaps in your civic knowledge.
And that's a great point. I never thought of that, because so many of us talk about our own rights, my right to free speech or whatever, but we don't always know all our rights and end up, I guess on the wrong side there. So, and how do you, teach your children about, what advice can you give people out there, teach your children in the home about civics? What have you folks done as parents?
Well, Gary, first I'd say be civically literate yourself.
Yeah.
Talk about government with your children, visit your state capitol, have your children write letters to governmental leaders when they have issues that concern them. And that's on the federal and the state level. I think a lot of people, when they think about government, think about the federal government. When I was Chief Justice, it used to occur to me that more than 90% of cases go through the state court system. The federal system actually sees fairly few. Most of your rights are going to be adjudicated in the state court system.
Mhm.
So back to the question of how does civic literacy get passed on? Reading newspapers, watching the news with your children, have them become involved in student government at school, and then take advantage of many of these free resources. And I'm absolutely sure Regent Penley and Speaker Bowers have thoughts on these subjects.
After you, Mr. Regent Penley.
I think Justice Birch has mentioned the most important part, and that is for parents to be engaged in our democracy and our republic themselves. I can still recall sitting down with sons and daughters and talking about, well, we get to vote on all these judges, yes or no. Mm-hmm. How you can possibly know that? Well, you've got to read some materials to be able to figure this out. And this is hard work to be able to cast those votes, because in most cases, judges do a great job and you keep them there in their positions. But it's our responsibility to try to identify where there may be ethical problems or other issues. And that's hard. And so we talk about that at dinner. I mean, there were a whole sort of things like that. I think that's part of it. I also think that what we have as an opportunity is to show our children that we do vote. And also, even though we may decry what we occasionally hear or read in the papers or on the news media or on social media, that all of those media serve a real purpose to educate us. That's important. But Speaker Bowers, you probably have more erudite things to say than I.
I have truly enjoyed this conversation. Just to be in it is an honor. Truly, the thoughts and how you express them, both of you and Gary, your leading of the conversation. It's really an honor to get into something a little bit deeper than the vote is in 10 minutes. Are you on or off? It's that kind of thing. I do believe, I remember hearing as a child, and I consider myself a child under 40, someone said the most powerful object in the training or in the guidance of a human being is not the electric chair, it's the high chair. And I was just thinking just last night, I have a very, very, very driven, powerful grandson, Lance, whose dad played down there at the U of A in the day. And he's going to be his dad's clone. I mean, the kid is a big and strong and just is nuclear. But when he wants something, you have to say, Lance, okay, let's be fair. You get it for a little while, you get the ball and then your brother gets the ball. Or you're speaking a little bit too loud, Lance, but we need to hear each other. All of those things just, hey, when was the last time I heard that? Yesterday on the floor of the house, you know, when somebody was displaying a lack of respect for somebody else's time, it's just multiplied. So it's the high chair, folks. And I think it's, and another thing about power, remember Lord Acton said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And Solzhenitsyn said, in a totalitarian system, any power corrupts. And I've thought myself, if I personally do not possess the self-discipline to correct myself, any power will corrupt me. And I think in a way, that's kind of a foundational thought in civics.
Well, you know, let's go back to, you know, civil discourse real quickly. You know, you mentioned what happened on the floor. And so is there a big difference between, and I think you started in 1993 when you were first elected to now? I mean, as far as the discourse on the floor of the chamber?
I think we look favorably at the past, the further away it is. And in the day, it might have been quite shocking what someone said. But with Art Hamilton and others, Bob McClendon, who recently passed away, in that time, there was a self-regulating presence among the membership that would not tolerate certain uncivil activity on the floor or even with each other. And if we were ever in a restaurant together, people would watch out for each other. There was a camaraderie and a collegiality that was respected. I think that has definitely been affected in a negative way. And a lot of the speech that people write me, I keep one as the absolute worst example of someone writing to an elected official. It's got to be about 200 words, and probably 190 of them are the most profane, crass, gross, intimidating, savaging words. And I get a lot of that. And I think, has anything changed? A lot. And the idea that we can anonymously attack, why is it that negativity is so easy and that to be civil takes a lot more effort? And I'm grateful that we can have the talk and to be a part of it.
But it's why I think, back to what Justice Birch said, Speaker Bowers, we really have to remember and celebrate what Justice O'Connor did over and over and over.
Yeah.
There are stories of her bringing people who were disagreeing with each other into her home, and she would cook for them and have discussions. And that sense of being able to have people in your home who didn't share the same views, and to sit down and eat with them and try to resolve those issues. I love those stories. And you know her better than I do, perhaps, Justice Birch, but I always thought that was a remarkable set of stories that should be something that we remember over and over today in the face of this negativity that you have described, Speaker Bowers.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And we've come to an hour, and it's time to conclude our program. I want to thank our sponsor, the Arizona Board of Regents, our panelists, and the viewers who made time at this hour to watch. I also want to offer Speaker Bowers one more congratulations, and let you know that our reporters are going to be calling you to get a comment today. And I'd like to remind everyone that our next morning scoop will be May 3rd. So keep an eye out, and we're going to be announcing the details. And have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. Take care. It's a pleasure.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.